The Collection of Ghost Stories. Volume 1. A novel by Neil Wesson. Chapter 6. The Signalman's Ghost. Albert Morrison had always had a passion for the railway. Both man and boy, he'd spent many an afternoon watching the steam engines pass the end of his terraced street. All the walls of the houses were black with soot from the combined chimneys of the house fires and the passing engines. From 6 in the morning to 9 at night, the clank of tank engines buffers ringing around the coal yard and streets of the huddled-together houses where Albert lived. The coal yard was the location of his employment. He was only a laborer, but loved being around the engines. Then on one cold morning in midwinter, a loose sack of coal dislodged itself from a slow-moving flat car. Albert tried to jump out of the way. The heavy sack landed on his right leg. The ankle was crushed, his employment terminated. Such accidents were not uncommon, and the staff knew not expect anything from the company. A week later he received a visit from his uncle. They sat in the front kitchen, Albert's leg raised in front of the fire. That visit brought him better news than he could ever had hoped for. A friend of his uncle's was the station master, of Brough railway station. A job as signalman was in the offing. The station master himself had lost a foot in the trenches of the Great War and on hearing of his friend's nephew's accident, offered him the post immediately. On Monday, 2nd February 1933, Albert Morrison climbed the wooden steps to the Brough East signal box. It was a dream come true for the young man just creeping into middle age. As he entered, the first thing he laid eyes upon was the bank of signal levers along the right-hand side. Above them the windows looked out onto the tracks running past. On the left-hand wall as he entered, which was the back wall, a large shelf protruded out and on it sat open a large book with a lamp shining down on it. The book was used to record all traffic passing over the level crossing. The click of a wall clock could be heard. This was situated on the wall above the shelf. At the east end of the box sat an old armchair and a table equipped with a kettle, teapot and a couple of old well-worn mugs. The kettle and teapot were also at least 10 years old and well used. The station master followed him in and over the next hour and a half informed him of his duties and the operations of the level crossing. "So, do you think you're up to it, young man?" asked the old man. "Oh yes, sir," replied Albert with an enthusiastic tone in his voice. The box was cold. Several of the windows were open to stop the room becoming misted up with condensation. A fire would soon cure that. The station master made a mug of tea for them both. He sat down on the chair and asked if Albert had understood everything. He had. After a lifetime of reading about, watching and talking to the men off the railway, there wasn't much he didn't know. One thing puzzled him: what had happened to his predecessor? When asked the question, the station master turned in the seat and paused a moment before answering. As he opened his mouth to speak, the bell rang. His first traffic of the day was minutes away. "Ah, here we go, Albert. Show me what to do." "Right," he said, preparing himself. He looked at the bank of levers before him. After pulling the change lever, he pulled the lever changing the westbound signal, so it dropped, leaving the green light showing. Then opening the door, he ran down the wooden steps and closed the two gates blocking off the road. Not that there was any traffic at his time of the day, or indeed at any time of day here. He returned to the box and waited to see what would come through. 2.5 minutes later, an A4 Pacific thundered past the box. The smoke blew high into the air as it shot through at high speed. Once clear, Albert went about reversing the process, changed the signal, then the changing lever, and finally once again he went down the steps onto the road and opened the gates. "Morning," a passing pedestrian said to him as he went about his business. "Good morning," replied Albert in good spirit. That was his first train through. On the opposite side of the road, a cinder footpath ran alongside the track up onto the eastbound platform of the station. Albert could see a figure, all in black, looking down the path toward him. It was still early, the sun had not yet rose above the horizon. It was only out the corner of his eye that he caught the fleeting glimpse. He finished opening the gate, the latch snapping into its clip on the post. He looked again down the alley. The figure was gone. It must have been a trick of the light, or the lack of it. He closed the door behind him and took off his hat and coat, hanging them up on the peg next to the door. "Forgotten something?" asked the old station master quizzically. "The logbook?" "No, just about to do it," he said, picking up a pen and recording the time and direction of the train in the duty log. "Well, I'll let you get on. The 6.40 hull will be coming through shortly." He put his mug of tea down and walked out of the box into the dark morning. Albert finished his mug of tea. He was happier now than for as long as he could remember. The bell rang once again. "Here we go," he said to himself. 5 minutes later it was all over. A freight train came through at a low, steady speed. The gates opened, signals changed, and the logbook was filled in. Varying amounts of time elapsed between traffic coming through his crossing. It stood on the main line linking Hull and Maine East Coast Line, as well as the Transpennine route linking East and West Coasts. By the time mid-morning had come, his heightened state of alert had waned somewhat. He knew that there was time to sit and read or make a cup of tea in between his duties. He took a book out of his bag and sat down to read. It was a copy of The Signalman by Charles Dickens bought for him by his uncle when he had been offered the job. He enjoyed ghost stories, and this particular one seemed to be have written just for him. As he read the spooky tale, he heard the sound of heavy footsteps coming up the steps. He froze with fear, his mind was still in the book. The door swung open and in stepped a black-faced figure, in fact he was black from head to foot. Albert, after a sudden moment of shock, breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that it was only the coal man covered from head to toe in coal dust. "Now then," said the black face, white lines protruding from the corners of his eyes and the creases in his face made by his large smile. "Coal," he said, dropping a black sack on the floor. "Morning," said Albert in return. "Cold day." The newcomer looking at the teapot, "Any tea on the go?" "Of course." Albert put his book down and poured 2 mugs of hot tea. He handed one to the coal man. "Here," he said, passing 1 mug over. "Oh, God bless you," he said, wrapping his cold black hands around the hot cup. "You the new guy then?" "First morning," he told him, sitting back down in his chair. "Let's hope you last longer than the last pair they had in here." Albert remembered that the station master had avoided the question with regard to his predecessor earlier that morning. "What happened to him?" I asked the station master, but he didn't say. "Him, the more like." His white teeth shone through his blackened face. "It all started, oh I'd say about 3 or 4 months since, before Christmas any road." He threw back as he took another mouthful of tea. "It was like this. I'm on the day shift," began the coal man, perching himself on the edge of the table. The bell rang. "Excuse me," said Albert, "duty called." The low winter sun shone in Arthur's eyes as he walked down the steps. He could see his breath in the cold air as he swung the gates closed. The sunlight wasn't strong, but bright enough to make him squint. There he was again, that man on the footpath, all in black. He could see a little more clearly now. The figure was wearing a hat, the brim of it throwing a shadow onto his face. "I'll have to go," said a voice from behind him. Albert turned quickly and with a start. Behind him stood the coal man, standing 1 step up from him. "Thanks for the tea, did me the world of good that." Arthur wasn't listening. "Do you know he is?" "Who?" Arthur pointed towards the path. "Him, I don't know who you mean," said the bemused coal man. "Him there, I see him every morn." His words were cut short as he turned to look at the strange figure, but now no one was to be seen. The path was clear, only the wind rushed down it. Again it had happened, yesterday, though it had been in the hours of darkness, and he had put it down to a trick of the light. The coalman's steam-driven van puffed off down the road toward the crossroads. Arthur returned to his box. Once in it, he peered down the path. He could see nothing. The bell rang, interrupting his thoughts. More traffic. As he walked along the bank of levers, his book fell to the floor after catching on his sleeve. He looked at it and thought of the story. The signalman in the story saw predictions of death and then ultimately his own demise. Was the strange figure a ghostly apparition? He read too many ghost stories. The next morning was stormy as Arthur took over the charge of the signal box from his night shift contemporary. "Good night," said George as he wrapped his collar up around his neck. "Bye, George," said Arthur, pouring a kettle full of hot water into the teapot. He took a sip of the hot drink and looked down the track. From behind him he heard the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. What's he forgotten? He muttered to himself, waiting for George's head to appear at the door. George's head never appeared though, nor did anyone else. Arthur felt a sudden chill come over him. Slowly he crossed the length of the box and looked out of the door. At the bottom of the stairs he could see a dark figure swinging a hammer down on what appeared to be one of the gates. He put down his mug and hurriedly put on his jacket and hat. On his way out of the door he picked up his lamp. It would be useful not only to light the way, but could be used as a formidable weapon. On the stairs the rain whipped into his face. The wind was coming from the north and had an icy bite to it. "You there?" he shouted at the figure, but what figure? No one was there. He stood looking at the empty road. Apart from the howling of the wind and the constant beating down of the rain, all was quiet. The ringing of the bell brought him back to the present. After closing the gate he was glad to get back into the safety of the box. 1 hour later he heard the sound of the footsteps coming up the stairs. With nowhere to run, Arthur waited to see who it was. A wave of relief swept over him when he saw the face of the coalman appear at the door. Minutes later he had his usual cup of tea and was warming himself by the fire. "Tell me, is this station haunted?" Arthur asked him. The coalman looked into his teacup and nodded. Slowly he told Albert the story. "Yesterday you asked me what had happened to your predecessor." "Yes." "Well, he is the one that haunts this station." "Heavens, why?" "It turns out that, well, let me start at the beginning." He sat himself on the edge of the table. "Here, sit down here," Arthur offered, vacating his old red leather armchair. "Thank you." He sat down, making himself at home in the seat. "The men that were stationed here before you now are both dead." For a second in that signal box the silence was deafening. The day shift man, David Morgan his name was. It turns out that he was sleeping with the wife of the night shift signalman. He knew that every night he would be here, so no chance of getting caught by him with his wife. Somehow though the night shift man, what was his name? Morris Pinder, that's him. Anyway he found out. So just over a month ago Morgan clocked on at 5:30 am as normal. Morris Pinder said his goodbyes before leaving for home. Morgan was none the wiser, he didn't know his secret had been discovered. Carrying on as normal he made himself a cup of tea and sat down to read the newspaper. The bell rang, he put his paper down and changed the signal. Outside he undid the latch that held the gate open. Two wild eyes were watching him. His back was toward the man skulking behind one of the bushes that grew on the boundary between the road and railway property. The figure of Morris Pinder slowly came out from the shadows carrying a hammer in his right hand. He rose it up above his head and brought it down on Morgan's head. The force threw him out onto the line, half conscious. Pinder followed him. Bending over the body he once again brought the hammer down on his head again and again cracking his skull. The hammer fell with vicious rapidity. The body lay on the ground dead but still the hammer rained down on him. The skull was whole and the soft pulp of the brain was exposed to the air. Pinder was a man possessed by hatred and jealousy. He didn't hear the frantic whistling of the engine speeding toward him. At the last moment the hammer raised above his head ready to strike one last time, he looked up and saw the Pacific engine approaching. The whistle drowned out the scream as his body was thrown over the two-bar fence that separated the rails from the footpath down to the station. Where did his body land? About half a mile down the path. That was where Arthur had just seen the dark figure standing. I never heard about it, it wasn't in the local newspaper. No, it was hushed up. The railway company told the police that it was an accident. That night Arthur's dreams were filled with the images of what must have happened that fateful morning. He did not sleep well, and when he got to work the next morning he was adorned with dark rings around his eyes. Bad night? Asked George. Yes, couldn't sleep. He replied taking off his coat. As Arthur sat in his chair drinking tea, his mind was still thinking of the murder there only weeks before. Still the coal man was coming early today, that was always something to look forward to, he would have the kettle on ready for him. The bell rang. The first morning's arrivals was on its way, so began another day. He changed the signal and put on his hat and coat. On leaving the box he dared to look up the path to the station. No one was there. He felt more than relieved. Bending down to unhook the latch a dark figure came up behind him and brought a hammer down on the back of his head. Arthur's body lurched forward onto the track. The hammer came down several times pummeling his head. The coal man's steam lorry was coming down the road, from in his cab he could see a strange occurrence at the level crossing. Something struck him as being wrong, he opened the regulator valve and hurried to the scene of the crime. As he pulled up a coal train thundered through. This time no body was thrown off the track. The brakes of the engine squealed in the darkness as the driver shut off steam. The coal man looked at the sliced up body on the track, he felt sick and then was sick by the side of the road. For half an hour he stayed there staring at the disassembled body. The driver of the train arrived, out of breath he had run back down the line. I didn't stand a chance. I only saw him at last minute. He wheezed. Him, what did you see? Asked the coal man without taking his eyes off of the body. Just him lying on the track, where's the signal man? He's the signal man. An uneasy pause ensued. You didn't see anyone else? No, just him. For the first time he looked up from the track. Halfway along the cinder track he could see a dark figure watching him. The end.